I will.
Well, hello, everyone. We're glad that you've joined us on this very windy Thursday afternoon here in Michigan, beautiful Michigan, wherever you're at. And we're really excited to have Lisa Bottomley. She is from MSU Extension, and she has been a wonderful partner for the Community Service Commission for many, many years. And today she's presenting on a comprehensive screening process that I think will be very applicable to any size organization. She's, has a wealth of experience in this, and we're really delighted to have her with us today. As we share in every single one of our trainings, these trainings are brought to you through the AmeriCorps with the Volunteer Generation Fund. And the goal of the Volunteer Generation Fund is to be able to help nonprofits across the state of Michigan to be able to increase their capacity and ability to engage more volunteers. So with that, we're all glad that every one of you, that you're with us. We're glad that you're here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. And I will be monitoring the chat, and I will be monitoring our participants. So thank you, everyone. And Lisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you're seeing my PowerPoint now. I'm Lisa Bottomley. I am coming to you from Grand Rapids. I work for Michigan State University Extension based on campus at MSU, but quite honestly, I'm not there that often anymore since COVID. I've been in volunteer management for over 25 years now, which it's kind of weird to say that out loud, but it's true. And hopefully I can share a few things with you today that will help you as you consider your screening process for your organization. And just bear with me as I toggle between two screens. If you've heard anyone speak from MSU Extension before, we just like to remind everyone that our programs and our educational resources are open to all. We do not discriminate. We want to provide education and services to everyone in Michigan and beyond when we can. And so it's just an important message we like to include in our presentations. Sorry, I'm trying to switch my screen and doing the wrong one. So when we talk about screening, I think it's important to mention, and here I'm gonna stop sharing my video just so that I'm getting a little feedback. Okay. Sorry about that. So volunteer screening involves using multiple tools to determine whether a volunteer applicant's a good fit for your available volunteer positions. And there's no one size fits all method for volunteer screening because what is needed depends on a variety of factors. As we discuss screening, it's important to consider the needs of your organization, the risk factors with the population you serve, and also with the volunteer role, what that role is and how much responsibility they have, the amount of supervision and training that will be provided to the volunteer, and other factors that are very specific to your organization. In general, when there's greater risk, you're going to want to have more comprehensive screening. And when there's less risk, you may choose methods that are less time consuming, but also a little less effective. It just really depends on that specific role. It's always wise to talk to your legal counsel when exploring policies related to screening. So while I want to share a lot of options, it should not take the place of talking to legal counsel because screening is part of your risk management practice. For some organizations, you might want to consider whether the same level of screening is needed for all volunteers. And as an example, at MSU Extension, we made a policy choice a few years ago to move to two different types of volunteers, and we label them gold and silver. And basically our gold volunteers form relationships with people on behalf of the university. They represent us in public and have important roles to educate people or care for others. And so they go through a lot more screening than our silvers, who often do more transactional work. They're so important to the work we do, but they're not building those relationships, which makes the level of risk a lot lower. And so that's something that you might want to consider if you have a lot of different volunteer roles. Maybe you don't have to have the same level of screening and training for each. If you want to know more about that or ideas about that, I'm happy to chat more about that during the Q&A, or you can reach out to me privately at some other time. So why do we screen volunteers? We could talk about this for a long time, and I could share some great stories, or not so great stories, but we won't go that much in depth. We screen volunteers because at the heart of our screening process is safety. This can include safety of program participants, staff, and other volunteers. And while we can't ever fully ensure safety in any program, we can reduce the risk that's inherent with bringing people together to do important tasks for our organizations. Some volunteer positions have a physical risk, and you may be screening for specific skills or certifications or knowledge needed to prevent injury. Programs that serve vulnerable populations have a responsibility to screen volunteers in an effort to prevent physical, sexual, emotional, or financial abuse of participants. Additionally, volunteers often represent our organizations in the public, and screening can help ensure that those who are taking on these important roles meet the standards of your organization and represent you well when interacting with others. So I'm not sure if you can tell what this is, but it's supposed to be Swiss cheese. That's what, when I searched for pictures, it said. And we often compare volunteer screening tools to Swiss cheese. And that's because each tool has some holes in it, or areas that they don't cover. And you have to layer multiple tools or multiple pieces of cheese to create this comprehensive plan that fully covers you and reduces the number of holes. So let's dig into that a bit more. There's no one tool that I'm aware of that'll help you gather all the information you need to make a wise volunteer selection decision. Volunteers complete important work on our behalf, and it's vital that we're thoughtful when filling positions, just as we are with paid staff. Oops, sorry about that. Accepting and placing the wrong volunteer can cause a drain on staff time, resources, and it can possibly harm your organization's image in the public. In the worst cases, the volunteer can cause harm to others. As much as we need volunteers and sometimes feel even desperate for more volunteers, try to remember that you need the right volunteers. And the right volunteer contributes to your mission. They give more than they take in terms of your organizational resources and time. And in short, they're a valued asset. The wrong volunteer can cause drama. They can suck up inappropriate amounts of staff time or client time, maybe cross some boundaries, and they can cause more issues than they help. It's far easier to decline an applicant than it is to terminate a volunteer. So I urge you to be thoughtful in these decisions. And sometimes it's hard to be super thoughtful because the vast majority of people who come to you are going to be amazing, and you get in the habit of accepting everyone. But you want to be aware that not everyone will be the right fit. Since there is no one tool to gather the information you need, it's important to create your own package of tools to gather the information that you need to make a decision. The available tools can be used to learn about an applicant's background, their skills, their experiences, and their ability to meet the position requirements. We're going to look at a variety of available tools and discuss the pros and cons of each to help you determine which you should be using Or in some cases, you might find that you've been using a tool that's really not giving you the information you need, and perhaps you could look at scaling back in some areas. So as we start talking about tools, and I should have said this earlier, feel free to interrupt me. I talk fast, but break in if there's a question. I'd love to stay current, and I'm not great at seeing the chat button go. So please feel free to unmute, or sometimes raising your hand can grab my attention too. So our main tools for collecting information to inform volunteer selection are an application, background checks, references, interviews, and observations made throughout the process. There's other tools as well that we'll hit on though, but let's dig into these a little bit. So the application, this is usually the starting point for any volunteer screening, and very few people opt out of using this tool because you need some way to gather name, address, email, whatever it is you need. But I would say while many programs collect applications, I find there's different levels of review taking place. The application has quite a few purposes, and it's important that you review what's there to get all the information that you can from it. First of all, the application allows you to collect contact information, applicant interests and their availability, answer questions that are important to your selection process, and it allows you to look for a few things, including some red flags. So some things to look for. First of all, it should go without saying, but read the entire application when it comes in. In addition to reading what's there, be aware of things that may be missing. Did the applicant skip any questions or provide incomplete answers? This could be a red flag if the volunteer role requires attention to detail. I like to ask questions to get a feel for what the volunteer is looking to do to make sure it matches the role or roles we have available. So for instance, if someone's looking to develop or use their leadership skills, they probably aren't going to be really fulfilled if I were to assign them to a data entry position. It's also important to compare the application answers to your interactions to make sure they're consistent. If an application reads as though the person's high energy and super excited, and in the interview, they're really closed off or flat, or they don't say much, I'm not saying it's a red flag to say, well, they can't volunteer, but it certainly is worth taking a closer look to see which is the true person you're getting out of that volunteer, or potential volunteer, I should say. You'll also want to compare any answers to questions related to criminal background checks that you conduct to make sure they were honest. We see this often where someone will say they have no criminal history, and yet when we do a background check, they do. And sometimes it's really minor, but you want to find out, first of all, if that was their criminal history, because we'll talk about this soon, but you're required to ask that. But beyond that, why didn't they mention it? And sometimes it's, well, I thought it fell off my record. But sometimes they just weren't honest, and that's giving you some sort of clue that you might want to consider. So now we're going to look at background checks. And we're going to start out by talking about the various types of background checks available, as well as challenges and concerns pertaining to background checks. And then we're going to look at specific checks and explain how to access them and review the advantages and disadvantages of each. I'm just going to peek. I see a few things in the chat. Oh, got it.
Yeah, I think we're doing good on the chat. If there are questions, feel free to put them in there, and then I can let you know too, Lisa, if they're there.
Perfect. Don't feel rude stopping me. So Nonprofits perform background checks on prospective volunteers as one way to ensure safety and security of their clients. And that's especially children and vulnerable adults. But I do want you to consider that any human can be vulnerable. Depending on where we are in life, we can be vulnerable to being manipulated financially or emotionally. And while it's few and far between, there are people who look to access others with bad intent. And sometimes they might come to programs that work with people that could attract a vulnerable population. Background checks of volunteers and staff are an important component of a risk management system. And the term background check can involve a variety of steps. That could be reference checks with previous employers and or volunteer supervisors, personal reference checks with friends and other acquaintances, a review of educational credentials, driving record checks, criminal history or criminal background checks, central registry check, sex offender registry check, just about anything you want to see that they've told you, you can find a way to look to see what their background says. Often a combination of checks are used to obtain all the relevant information about a person who will be entrusted with the safety and well-being of your clients and or personal information about others. With greater availability of information and an increased focus on safety and security, more organizations are scrutinizing both employees and volunteers through a more rigorous background check process prior to allowing them to work with clients. We live in a very litigious country, and some of this comes down to really making sure that we are not putting ourselves in harm's way. The other part is sometimes people do bad things and we need to protect others. So those are the two reasons that these background checks are becoming more and more common. But there's flaws with these checks, and I think it's important to know that and not get a false sense of security from them. Some criminal history checks are more reliable than others, and so you want to know the limitations. So let's chat a little about that. So to be confident of a background check, it must be, first of all, reliable. And that means that we want to have confidence that the correct person's record has been checked. For example, when conducting criminal and other history checks, we often use name-based searches. Every name-based search is subject to unreliable results because of name changes, aliases, and the possibility that the individual has provided incomplete information. Fingerprint background checks, while more expensive and difficult to obtain, are far more reliable than a name-based check. Name-based checks become more reliable as you add other factors such as birth date or address, but remember that one typo makes the name-based check irrelevant, because if I were to look for me and spell my last name wrong, all the criminal history check is going to say is no one by that misspelled last name had a criminal history. We also need to be sure that the information is accurate. We want to be confident that correct and necessary information has been obtained. For this reason, we must rely on the agencies compiling the information and trust that the information was entered correctly. Now and again, you will come across, if you do enough of them, a criminal background check from a volunteer applicant, and they'll have a hit. And when you talk to the applicant, they freak out because it's not them. And so I've encountered that a handful of times in my career, and we have to give them the information needed to get that off their record and put wherever it belongs. It's just important to know that these are not flawless. It can happen. And normally when it does, the person's devastated. I had one gentleman realize that was probably why he was denied a few employment opportunities. He had no idea this incorrect criminal hit had been on his record, and it was significant. So we have a responsibility and a legal responsibility to tell people when those hits come on their records. I'm going to just do a little mute here. There we go. And finally, we want to know the information is complete and includes as much detail as possible and that the information is up to date. Results of the criminal history check are out of date as soon as it's completed. Someone can do something on the way home from giving you permission to conduct one. Also, accuracy and completeness may be compromised by individuals pleading guilty to lesser offenses, having records expunged, or by the court orders that protect certain information from disclosure. Some systems do not share information on all crimes, and there is no individual system that collects all the information. So let's pause for a moment before we go through the different checks. The more private personal information an organization obtains, there becomes a greater obligation to manage and protect that information. Policies should be in place to keep applicant information safe, and all individuals who have access to files should have the appropriate training related to confidentiality. This is really important as we look at more and more identity theft. People trust us with information that we need to do to complete the screening process, but we have to protect that information at almost all costs. I wouldn't say all costs, but as much as we can. I also want to remind you not to develop a false sense of security about a volunteer applicant based on one criminal history check. A criminal history check tells you what someone has been charged with. So arrested for, charged with, a judgment was found. There are lots of things that happen in the world that the legal process does not get involved in. This is simply a criminal background check. So it's one piece of a puzzle. It's not comprehensive enough to provide complete security. And yet I know there's a lot of programs that is their screening process, and a lot can get missed if that's just your screening process. It's important to do. You don't want to not do it, but there should be other data collection points to help you make a decision to ensure the safety of participants, volunteers in the program. Finally, it's possible to incorrectly identify an individual. Dismissing an individual or denying them an opportunity or making incorrect allegations could have consequences of discrimination, libel, or slander. Organizations must protect the rights of individuals they are checking. FCRA, which stands for the Federal Credit Reporting Act, requires organizations to provide applicants with a copy of their criminal history report or access to it and information on how to contest results. Now, in reality, most people don't want a copy of a report that says there's no criminal history. You can give that to them if they ask, but what this is really talking about is if you have a hit, you have to say, hey, Lisa, you gave us permission to conduct your criminal history check. Here's what we found. I'd like you to review it. And is this you? And then if I say yes, you can use that as a talking point, because for most of us, a criminal history in and of itself should not keep us from accepting a volunteer. You look at what the severity was, what the how long ago it was, if there's a pattern of crimes. It depends on the role, right? What you're looking at, but it allows that entry point for a conversation. And then anyone you've conducted a check through has directions for you if someone wants to contest. You cannot contest for them. They have to contest themselves if they say that's not them. And so my recommendation is you pause the screening process while they work through that, unless it's such a low level crime that it wouldn't impact selection anyways, and then get back going once they go through that. But recognize how stressful that is and be careful in your words. These are delicate conversations, and you want to respect a person as you approach them. So let's talk about national criminal history checks. There's a number of providers for national background checks and a number of companies who provide these specifically for nonprofit and volunteer-driven programs. The main reason you want to consider these checks is because many people don't live in the same state their whole life. So if you did a Michigan check, you're not going to see crimes that occurred in other states. That said, national checks have a number of cons. Depending on your program, you may want to add another criminal history check to a national check to help layer that Swiss cheese and reduce the holes. The first con is the cost. This can vary significantly, but national checks are going to cost money almost all the time unless you work in an organization that has access to them in a different way. Second is time. It can take days or even weeks to get these checks back, depending on how the company verifies hits or crimes that come up. Some companies verify the identity after if there's a hit, and those can come back more quickly, or at least the no-hit records come back more quickly, where some companies verify a person's identity before running the check, and that can take a little while. Finally, the biggest failing is that these are pretty incomplete, and that's because each state has different requirements on what crimes can or must be reported to national registries. And this means that sometimes you'll only learn about high-level felonies, even if there are many lower-level crimes that would cause you concern or at least pause, depending on the state that those happened in. In my experience, we often get national reports with no hits on volunteers who, when we conduct an Ichat, which I'll talk about next, a Michigan check, there'll be quite a few Ichat hits, which means that Michigan, our in-state system, we see all of these hits, but they don't report all of those crimes to the national systems. And some of it is just a matter of how much data that is, the workload, and usually with national checks, you are looking for those higher level crimes, but it's just important to know that. So let's talk about Ichat. Ichat stands for Internet Criminal History Access Tool. And at Ichat's website, you can see it here on the screen. It's operated by the Michigan State Police and accesses information from the MSP Criminal History Record Database. That's a mouthful. So this is what it looks like when you get to their homepage. And searches cost $10 each. However, nonprofits, government, and charitable organizations qualify for free background checks as long as you meet their requirements, which includes documenting that you have the applicant's permission to conduct the search and that you will share results with the applicant pursuant to FCRA. To register with Ichat, you can click on resources to get a tutorial, and that'll include the forms and everything needed if you don't already have an agency record. If you're part of a larger organization, it's very likely that the larger organization already has an agency record there, and you might have to find out what your code is. For instance, MSU has an agency record, and all of our programs fall under that. So each tool has advantages and disadvantages. I know I keep saying that. So the advantages of Ichat, it's free to most of us. And you can immediately access Ichat via the internet and get those results right away. The system provides information on certain arrests, charges, and convictions in Michigan. It only requires some pretty basic information: name, gender, race, date of birth. And finally, Ichat's 99% accurate. So what's wrong? Or what's not as good? On the con side, Ichat has the potential to be unreliable because it uses a name-based search. Name-based searches are only as good as the information you are given and that you type in. You may want to ask for photo ID to verify the name is correct, but be aware that aliases, misspellings, and multiple people with the same name can lead to incorrect results. That's why fingerprint checks are more reliable, but those can be cost prohibitive. And we have found for a lot of programs, it's depending on if you're a school or not, sometimes they can be almost impossible to access right now. The information received is specific to Michigan, and it doesn't include information from other states where crimes may have been committed. Potential volunteers who've lived in other states may or may not disclose this information when they apply, so you don't know if you should be checking other states. And if the information, or I should say, but if the information is disclosed, then it would be important to do either a background check in the states they had lived in, or at least a national check. Another con of this check is that not all charges, misdemeanors, for example, are always reported to the system, and information may not be up to date because of delays by local agencies in providing information to the Michigan State Police. At one point in time, and this was many years ago, but the gentleman or the officer responsible for Ichat had told us that they were 6 months backlogged in entering information concerning misdemeanors. Now, I do believe computers are far more advanced and some things happen in real time, but it's just important to know that. You'll remember that we said this check is 99% accurate. And while that's true, it's considered to be only 80% complete. And that's largely because the crime may not be logged in the system yet. So the next check you might consider is the Michigan Sex Offender Registry. This check is often used by youth serving organizations or organizations that put volunteers in close, unsupervised contact with others. The Michigan Sex Offender Registry is operated by the Michigan State Police and is freely accessible on the internet. When you log in to the Michigan Public Sex Offender Registry and click on Search Your Area, which is one of the buttons, this is what you'll see. So advantages, the cost, because it's free. It's also really easy to access, and you can get immediate results by logging onto the website. You don't need permission to run this check. In fact, many people run it in their neighborhood, on their own house, just to see who's nearby. So you can do it by name or address. Another strength is the searches can be conducted with limited information. Name, estimated age, or zip code are all you need. If the name is on the registry, then you will receive the individual's full name, aliases, date of birth, personal identifiers such as height, weight, scars, tattoos, etc., and the types of offense or offenses for which the individual was convicted, and possibly a photograph. All that information is going to help assist you in knowing if it truly is the person you were searching for, or if it's someone with the same name. The disadvantages of the Michigan Public Sex Offender Registry are many of the same challenges that are found with other name-based checks. They're only as reliable as the information given by the volunteer. Additionally, information can be incomplete or inaccurate because of records being expunged, defendants pleading to lesser charges that may not be subject to inclusion. Also, people have to update their address, and so there can be delays in that. And finally, it doesn't provide information concerning those who have been charged with other crimes or who have been charged but not convicted, even if they've been charged multiple times. So now let's talk about the National Sex Offender Registry. The Drew Sojan National Sex Offender Public website can be found at nsopr.gov. This site is sponsored by the FBI, and it searches all 50 state sex offender registry websites, as well as those in Washington, D.C., Guam, Puerto Rico, and Indian country. You can search by name or click on advanced search. Please note that you can gain more information by following links within the website under the banner. The advantages of the National Registry include the easy access, that it's free, available anytime, and just how wide the search goes. It's helpful when screening potential volunteers who've lived in other states. The disadvantage of the site is the inconsistency. Each of the state registries operate under different laws and rules, so there is little consistency in the types of crimes that are reported, what they're called state to state, or the information that's accessible. It would be wise to click on the individual state sites, which are found on the registry, to learn about the reporting requirements if you are finding a hit or just searching a specific state that you're aware of. I've also found that when we get hits from other states, we normally have to start doing some Googling to find out what that actually means, because things are called different, crimes are labeled differently in different jurisdictions sometimes. Next, we'll look at the Central Registry. So some organizations include a Central Registry check as part of their screening process. You can find more information and forums at the michigan.gov/DHS website, or just by searching for Michigan Central Registry. Names of individuals are placed on the statewide Child Abuse and Neglect Central Registry if there's a preponderance of evidence that the individual has abused or neglected a child, and the future risk to the child is high or intensive. The Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act requires states to check any child abuse and neglect registry on any prospective foster or adoptive parent and other adults living in a prospective foster or adoptive parent's home. Michigan's law also allows specific entities, such as employers and volunteer agencies, to obtain CPS case record information, including Central Registry information. It's a mouthful. This check is different in that a request for a check needs to be made by the person who's being checked. So in this case, the volunteer applicant has to ask for the information. They can request that the results be sent to you, but you will only get a copy of the results if they are not on the registry. If they're on the registry, the results will only be sent to the person who was checked, and it would be up to them to give you those results. I know that can sound confusing, so just holler at me if I've confused you. But a few things about it. So the pros, it's free, and it provides information specific to child abuse issues. Now let's talk about the cons. One disadvantage of this check is that it includes information only on those who are subject to Michigan Department of Human Services jurisdiction. This includes daycare facility owners and employees, parents, and family members. Teachers, members of the clergy, general citizenry, anyone who doesn't have custody of the child in question isn't included on the registry. Michigan law restricts the use and disclosure of information obtained from the registry. That is what I was talking about, saying that DHS could send you a letter indicating there's no record of a case if the applicant gave permission for this, but if there is, you don't get the letter. If someone's in the registry, they will need to tell you, and then you'll need to determine if they are fit to volunteer. This may seem simple, but consider the case of foster parents. Many foster parents are on the registry because it's common for youth in transition, in trauma, to make allegations. Now, within the registry, you'll learn if they were found to not have, if the person was not found guilty of anything, but their name could be on there for repeated allegations. This can be a cumbersome process that can take quite a bit of time. The applicant has to go to the office to request this, fill out a form, provide photo ID. And it says on the website still, I checked this, it says it can take 10 days. We had reason to request this from someone in the recent past, and it took a couple months. And I think it's just backlogs of things with COVID and open positions and things like that. So this can be cumbersome for someone to manage. While certainly this can be needed for some roles, this step might be a bit more than the average nonprofit needs for their screening process. So other possible checks to consider: employment verification, education verification, checking on credentials, certifications, or trainings, driving records. A lot of times these are more needed when there's specialized positions, and feel free, if there's other checks that you use or you're aware of, add them to the chat box. I'm covering the most common, but absolutely, if a volunteer role involves driving, it's a good idea to check their driving record to make sure that your organization wants to provide that insurance and risk management coverage for them. So let's talk a bit about reference checks. Reference checks, both personal and professional, can provide information that criminal history checks cannot. They can help you see if the candidate views themselves in a way similar to others, and if they have realistic views of their strengths and possibly challenges. Depending on the volunteer role, it may be important that the volunteer works well with others, and references will help you see if the applicant has that skill. While most references are positive, there are times when a reference who is assured of confidentiality will share critical concerns that may cause you to deny an applicant. For you serving agencies, I lean heavily on this question. Would you trust this individual with the care of your child or a child you care about? Why or why not? I find that question helps someone think more seriously about the responsibility of that sort of role. On the con side, and these tend to go more towards process, references can take some work. Even with the addition of technology that can help automate the process, people will inevitably miss an email, set aside a form, or forget about it, or they might hesitate because they're unsure of what they want to say. And it's really hard to tell the difference between someone who forgot to complete a reference and someone who chose not to, where one is a red flag and the other is just kind of life these days, right? Some companies have really strict rules related to references. And so the reference could feel very negative because all they'll do is verify employment. And so sometimes you'll get such a bland reference that you even feel like you have to grab some more. If you choose to collect references, one trick to increase the likelihood of getting them returned promptly is to ask the volunteer for more reference names than you require. So for instance, at MSU Extension, we only require 3 references to be completed, but we give the volunteer the opportunity to give us 5 names and contact information because we find that usually 3 of them will respond. The volunteer applicants who only give 3 sometimes take longer to process because people just don't get to it. The other thing though, is you can tell the applicant to please give their references a heads up and let them know whether it's you're going to get a phone call or you're going to get an email or you're going to get a link to a form. Some people also have luck in having the volunteer applicant themselves send out the link to the form if your system allows that sort of access. Interviews. So our next tool is interviews. And interviews allow you the opportunity to dig deeper after reviewing all the other information that was collected. You can ask questions that went unanswered on the application, ensure that you understand interests and strengths, and make sure that the position is a fit, both, and it's mutually beneficial for your organization, but also for the applicant. So for instance, I used to manage youth mentoring programs, and we had a 1-year minimum commitment. And the research told us it causes more harm than good to have that mentor leave early. So in the interview, I would ask about how long they were committed to. And occasionally I'd learn someone just had, a required number of volunteer hours they wanted, or my professor is making us volunteer this semester. And they really weren't planning to be there long-term, even though throughout the process, it said 1 year, 1 year, 1 year. So sometimes that interview just helped really look at those requirements and making sure it was a fit. Now, in those cases, the interview shifted at that point, and we discussed other potential positions, some within my organization, and sometimes it was others in the community that could be a better fit. Because I believe as volunteer coordinators, it's so hard to find a volunteer that when you have someone interested in serving, we owe it to each other. If they're not right for our organization and we don't have serious concerns, let's try to get them where they're going to be able to make a difference and help out our colleagues in other places as well. When the interview was going well in that position I was talking about, and I could tell the applicant was able to make the commitment, there were no red flags, or I was not overly concerned. We all have red flags. Then I was able to learn more about them that assisted me in the matching process. And so interviews, while they should be structured, should allow that leeway for what's needed most with that applicant. Sometimes it's diving deeper into concerns. Other times it's navigating which role might be right. And other times you move a little into orientation during it because you've gotten to know them throughout the process and you're close to acceptance already. The pros and cons of interviews. So interviews allow you to gain information you just can't get through background checks, applications, or references. You get to see how the person interacts with you, and you can observe how they interact with others they encounter in your office, if it's at your office. You can answer their questions, which will help them determine if this is truly the volunteer position for them. And then for those who will eventually become volunteers, it allows them to begin to form a relationship with staff and a sense of belonging, which is part of how we retain people, is making sure they're taken care of and they feel like they belong. The con is that interviews take time, especially when they're conducted well and not just as part of a checklist. Prior to the pandemic, most of us wouldn't have considered virtual interviews. It wasn't part of volunteer management strategy or training. But I think many of us have learned that when there are no major concerns from the other screening data, a virtual interview can be effective. So that can help you save on time, especially travel time. Finally, I want you to consider your own observations and the observations of other team members as a screening tool. Don't discount your interactions and observations throughout the process. Was the person prompt, respectful, engaged? If you have a position description with a desired trait for the role, compare the description with the candidate. Someone can be a great person with no red flags, but still they're the wrong person for the job. And I'm sure we can all think of some volunteer roles that we ourselves should not be placed in. For me, I could never be a coach or a referee for a sport. First, I don't tend to know the rules, and that would be a really bad fit from a skill level. Additionally, I hear how you have to have really thick skin to take on these roles these days. And quite honestly, I don't think I'm up for it. And I think a good volunteer coordinator would pick up on this through the interviews, and maybe they could help use me with snacks or to assist with some behind the scene tasks instead. Doesn't mean you have to say no, but you could think, what else? Because an unhappy volunteer or a volunteer who's misplaced is less likely to stick with you for the long haul. And they're less likely to talk positively about your organization. So volunteer screening has two main components. The first is to gather all the data. And I hope I've given you some information to ponder related to the tools you can use to gather information. Are you gathering enough information right now? Do you need more or less? Once you have the information, the next step is to put it all together and make a choice. Screening shouldn't be seen as a checklist. Get that idea out of your head. It's a process. You want to look to see if there are any lingering flags that cause you pause. And if so, talk to your supervisor to determine next steps. Maybe you need to have a second interview with someone else there with you. Maybe you need to look at a different position. And sometimes we unfortunately need to decline an applicant. Speaking of declining an applicant, it's really important to have some clear guidelines as to when an applicant will not be accepted and when there's discretion. You should also know who makes the ultimate decision. I think this is really important with criminal histories because sometimes someone will call you and say, I have this on my record. Should I bother applying? And you owe them an honest answer. And so these are crimes we never accept, or we don't accept within 3 years of that crime or whatever. What's the minimum commitment that you won't take someone for less time than that? Those are all things you should know before you start screening someone, because it's incredibly rare to end up interacting with someone and just not seeing some good in them. And so that's how I think we accept people who aren't the right fit sometimes, and then problems ensue. And by right fit, again, it could be a great person, wrong role, or wrong organization. If you are not a faith-based organization and someone is volunteering in hopes of sharing their faith, that can be a horrible fit. There's a constant push-pull between what's allowed based on your funding source and what they want to do in their heart. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing so that you can see each other in case you want to have some discussion. Real quick before I stop sharing, here's my contact information. I am happy to chat, share resources. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email if there's anything that you don't want to talk about in the chat, but we do have time for those who are interested. So,
Lisa, did you see the question about where do you find information about the driving check? Did you cover that? Maybe you saw it.
I did not see that. So, usually you go through your insurer. So at MSU, we send it to HR who can do that. But generally, whoever insures you, it's to their benefit that you're checking this. So your insurance provider will usually provide those for you. That's who I would talk to first. And they don't require a ton of information to do that.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, for a lot of programs, there are volunteers that do end up in an automobile on behalf of the organization. And a lot of times, sometimes it's even, driving a client. So that's a great question. Linda, I'm really glad that you asked that.
It is a great question. And sometimes the one thing I talked about declining volunteers, but sometimes you might choose to accept a volunteer with restrictions. And for us, restrictions sometimes are on driving. Maybe there's no severe criminal history, but there's a whole lot of driving issues. And so we just say, you can't drive others. You can volunteer with us, you can lead a club, You just can't have others in your car. And that's one way that these different ways of screening, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You just have to think about the role and safety.
Yeah, we talked about that in previous sessions about modifying the risk and modifying the activities to make it safe and to be able to have good people in those roles. But you're absolutely right about making sure that I'm with you, Lisa. I could not referee or judge a game. My husband.
I'd be like, where's the sports ball? What are they doing?
Yeah. I'm like, I'm not sure what's happening here. Now, my husband, on the other hand, he and his friends, they're referees. They can do it. They're tested. They know the rules inside and out. No one's going to trip him up on that. And he has a pretty thick skin for that. Me, on the other hand, no. And then, the other thing too is just listening to your gut. I mean, a lot of times we have an instinct about someone. I remember a time when an individual came in and it was like instantly, he was sort of like a confrontational person. And then he went into the interview and the person thought he was great. Well, you know what? Guess what? We had issue after issue with that kind of confrontation behavior. And it's an opportunity. I wish we had caught it on the onset and we didn't. And but it really caused us to also put some other practices in place that it's okay not to give an answer in the interview. It's okay not to place that person. And one of the things that we ended up doing was we were doing group interviews as a first screening. But if there was anything that was a red flag, if anyone saw it as a red flag, we kind of had a clue and that we'd give each other. And then, you know what, no one would get placed. And then we would have them talk with me as the director. And then we would, place everybody else who was just fine. And then we would address that one person so that there was no embarrassment, things like that. And, I remember we also refined our process a little more to even on the onset to say, even before you apply, if you think that there's something in your background or, before you apply, if there's something you need to talk to us in private, give us a call. One of the things that was always very difficult if someone had a disability, we worked with lots of people with disabilities, but it was a hard thing when you would put someone with a disability in with a group of really high functioning college students, like the cream of the crop college students, for an interview. And it kind of was like, it was difficult for that person. So what we would end up doing is we would end up saying, if there's something, we'd be able to make sure we got that person the supports that they need. And we worked really hard to make sure that they had job coaches, whatever it is that they needed to be successful. We could make some accommodations, and then we could also alter positions to make it ideal for that person. And we had actually really a great track record with people with lots of different capabilities, is kind of what we always called it. But it worked out beautifully, as long as we maintain that person's dignity in those moments too. Does anyone else have things like that they've come across?
Yeah, anyone else have anything you'd like to share on that? And one thing that you triggered for me is the more you can talk in the way of if selected, because if you act like the person's already a volunteer and then red flags come up, it creates more tension. And so throughout the whole process, it's if you're selected and if you select us as well. Remember that they're checking you out the same way where they should be. And that way it allows either party to bow out with a little less tension. No one likes to be told no, but if they thought they were already told yes, it's worse.
Yeah. And, we actually would start off an interview with the fact that we don't accept everyone, and there could be a reason that is beyond, I can't remember exactly how we said it, but we always did say that we would help them if we couldn't find a good fit in our organization. We would help them find a good fit in another organization. And I think we were always pretty true to that word, especially when a criminal background check did come up, because we would take time to make sure that maybe it was something that was innocent enough, but we couldn't take them in our situation, but they would be perfectly fine elsewhere, and doing really meaningful work in another organization. And so it was always about protecting that dignity of that person.
Absolutely. Lisa's asking me if there's any general waiver language available, and I'm happy to share what we have with our background check providers. So feel free to shoot me an email and I can send you what we've had. At least it gives you a starting point that you can run by your counsel, and sometimes depending on who, like if you're doing iChats, they're going to ask you to share a copy of what you use. And I haven't found that they would tend to push back much, but I know some others have wordsmithed it a little, and then I make sure our lawyer likes it and we go back and forth. But at least I know our lawyer and our current company have both approved ours. So I'm happy to share it as an example.
I think your point of partnering with your HR department, if you're an organization that has that, and your legal counsel, is extremely important. And then also being very careful about not like who says the no to that person and who ends up, if it ever comes to this, who has to terminate that individual, and being very clear on that.
And with that, being mindful that while you have that policy, we've had times where we weren't certain that safety was guaranteed for our staff in those situations. And so we've contacted the police ahead of time. There's been threats, stuff like that. Sometimes the reason you're not accepting someone is also a reason you won't feel safe. And so no one should make these decisions in a bubble, and you should have others help you think about it. And this is so, again, I've been doing this for multiple decades. It's only a handful of times that we deal with some of them. And we're a statewide organization with 14,000 volunteers, and I have to have my hands involved in all these issues. So please don't freak out that everyone has to deal with this. But instead of saying no right away, be thoughtful. And if your organization's greener, newer, and you haven't had to deal with something like that, your colleagues aren't just the people who are in the same building. They can be others of us on the screen who can problem solve with you and share what we would do in our organizations. I think we owe that to each other.
Yeah, the commission is always here. And I think that's a way to look at MSU Extension. They're always here. They're a great partner. If you've never dealt with it, you're fortunate. But if you're in this long enough, at some point you may. And the other thing is, I would never reject someone in person. We would always do it over the phone. And I would always try to give someone that courtesy of a phone call and give them the moment to, process it and be able to explain it, to, their side of it. And then being very conscientious of my tone of voice and never be like accusatory. That's one of the other reasons why we were always very careful about who that was that delivered that message. And it was never made in a bubble. As Lisa said, I would always have multiple people that I would connect with. And in the whole time I've done this, which is also multiple decades, only once have I had to involve the police or security, actually twice, involve security or the police department. So that shows you it's not very often, but we would never want anyone to be in a position where they were way in over their heads very quickly. And we probably both could have been if we hadn't had a good plan ahead of time to address it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other questions or
Or
thoughts?
tips.
Or tips? Yeah,
that,
share what you have too. We love that.
yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for joining. And by all means, if there's any resources I can share, we have a lot of educators who work and program coordinators and volunteer management, but our educators have created a lot of resources. And I'm happy if you have specific questions to send you some links to articles or fact sheets that might be helpful if this is, especially those of you who are either relooking at a policy, developing a new policy or program in this area. It can be super overwhelming, and hopefully you don't have to start from scratch. We can at least give you a few things to get you going.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, Lisa, for being with us today. You're always an incredible resource, and we're so fortunate to be able to have you in our backyard here in East Lansing, and then also just to be able to always count on you as a great partner to the commission. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. This is always a thoughtful conversation that we have around background checks and things like that. And you just did such a great job, Lisa, of just explaining this in such a nice way, and being so thorough about the information that you presented. With that, I will send out the recording, and I'll make sure that I put Lisa's contact information there too. If you should down the road need to have some resources, and then we're always here as well. With that, does anyone else have anything that they would like to share? Jordan says, thank you so much. As a new organization, you helped me make this portion way less scary. So
Good. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Oh, well, thank you, everyone. I will follow up with the recording, and then we do have another training at the end of the month on the 28th, and Linda from the UP will be doing a youth training with us, and so this is kind of a nice transition into our youth segments that we're going to be doing coming up here. So I will send out information on that so you can all sign up for that as well. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us today, Lisa. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. With that, I'll go ahead and I'll stop the recording.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for having me. Looks like we're good.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That was terrific. It was so thorough. That was wonderful.
Well, I feel like we all have the things we do. So you have to push yourself to think of what don't I use? And maybe why.
And you know what I love about this too is always that opportunity to, it's kind of hard sometimes on the, with the participants always to be able to engage with them versus if we were all in a room together. But I think that they do get a tremendous amount out of this, and we're seeing so many more people, and I would not be at all surprised if folks followed up with you afterwards, because we get a lot of that every single time.
Nice. Well, I will definitely let you know if there's any themes, or if I see the same question a few times, I'll let you know if there's a resource that you might want to send the group.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Yeah. And good luck with your presentation. Is it next week? Your next presentation?
Yes. Or in 2 weeks. Well, next week we have spring conference, and then, I'm going to Tulsa.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully we won't have any wind in Tulsa for you.
Right? No tornadoes.
It was just howling during this. At one point I thought I had to get up and go look to make sure I thought my shed had blown away or something. And it's like a wood shed. I heard something crazy out there. So
I know. I was like, hopefully they're not hearing the howls, but I think everyone's hearing it at their own place.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. So, oh my God.
Uh,
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your week. It's almost Friday.
Yay. Take
Yay.
care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.